Hi, today we're going to talk about Marx again, part two of our discussion of Karl Marx. The concepts we're going to focus on today are private property, objectification, alienation, and capitalism. Now, the majority of what we're going to talk about today is alienation, probably Marx's main concept, but the other concepts are important and it makes a whole sort of interrelated set of ideas. Um, when we get to capitalism, you'll see that he's a critic of capitalism, and you'll see how that plays out. To start our discussion today, I wanted to read a quote of Marx for you. He said of private property, he said, "Private property has made us so stupid and partial that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, when it is directly eaten, drunk, worn, inhabited, etc." He went on to say, "The less you are, the less you express your life. The more you have, the greater your alienated life." Let's reflect on that, the idea that the more you have, the greater your alienated life. Now, what he was saying was that a human being's main motivation should not be what he described as material gain or the idea of accumulating private property and more possessions. Instead, he would say that the more possessions you accumulate, the more focus you place on things, the less focus you will place on what really matters in life. And that, for him, was developing meaningful, passionate relationships with other human beings. That's what brings people happiness and pleasure. Um, but we lose sight of that in capitalism. Often we lose sight of those true needs and instead focus on material gain or accumulating more and more possessions. Now, a Marxist named Erich Fromm wrote of a hypothetical story that I think makes this point quite well. Um, what he wrote about was this idea of seeing a beautiful flower and how someone should interact with a beautiful flower. Say you're walking down the street, I picked out pictures of sunflowers because that's my wife's favorite flower. But think of your favorite flower. So if you see this beautiful flower, what do you do with it, right? Um, Now, a capitalist may say, well, I'm going to pick this flower and I'm going to take it home and I'm going to put it in a vase of water and it's going to be mine and I'm going to enjoy it for myself. Now, the problem with this perspective is that if you do that, eventually, in a couple weeks down the road, the flower is going to die, right? That, and also other people won't be able to enjoy this flower, right? You've taken it, you've brought it to your own home, so you can have it, and that's sadly the way a lot of people live their lives or think about things. Is they want to have things that are scarce and enjoy them, um, things that other people can enjoy, and we often don't really share these things with other people. Now, if you're uh, very smart, perhaps a smart, resourceful capitalist, what you might do is you might go home and get a shovel and a pot, and you go and you dig up the flower and you replant it on your land or in your house. But again, this flower is not going to be shared by other people. So what should we do with this flower? Fromm says that we should uh, interact with the flower in an engaged way. Smell the flower, look at the flower. If we do that in an engaged way, that flower will be ours forever, in our memory, right? But sadly, many people don't live their lives in an engaged way where and instead have to rely on um, physical objects for remembering what they enjoyed. For example, I remember going on a vacation with my family, and um, my wife was taking pictures, constantly taking pictures of things. I was like, why are we taking so many pictures of all these different things? Um, and she said she wanted to be able to remember them. Well, frankly, the picture taking can get in the way of actually just enjoying the vacation or enjoying a special moment with your child. We get so focused on wanting to uh, document these memories and have them in the form of pictures. Fromm would say those become alienated memories because we rely on the picture to remember things, right? So, I mean, if people think about their houses burning down, what would be the first thing they want to take out of their house? Well, it may be their photo albums, right? That may be because they are relying on those photos to remember have access to their memories. He's arguing that if you live an engaged life, you won't have to rely on those memories, those photos for memories. Another sort of funny story has to do with when my daughter was conceived. My wife had never been pregnant before and thought she might be. We were trying to have a child, and so what we did was we went out and bought a pregnancy test, and the way this thing works is the potential mother, expectant mother, she goes and pees on a little wand, a little stick, and you wait 5 minutes, and then you go back in and see if the stick has a plus sign. That means that she's pregnant, and if it doesn't, that means that she's not pregnant. Well, so she does this, and we go and we sit for 5 minutes, and we have this beautiful conversation. We're very excited about the idea of having a child together, and then we wait for 5 minutes to be up. We go in, we look at the stick, and it has a plus sign, and I have this beautiful moment together where we're just so excited and happy, a moment I'll never forget. And about 30 seconds into this beautiful moment, my wife says, "Quick, get the camera." And I'm like, "What? Why are we getting the camera?" But I'm not stupid enough to say that to my wife. I did what she said for me to do. I went and got the camera, and what she wanted to do was she wanted to take a picture of that plus sign on the stick that she had peed on. And so I took that picture, and we still have that picture, and frankly, we still have that wand with the stick with the plus sign on it. But they live in a drawer somewhere. We don't think ever look at those things, and it's the point is just live in the moment and enjoy your life and not worry about having to document everything. That would be a way that Marx would encourage people, and Fromm would encourage people to live their lives in an engaged way, not focusing on accumulating possessions or documenting every moment with the possession, but rather just to enjoy the beauty of your day-to-day life. Okay, so another interesting quote comes from a book by Dr. Seuss. Now, this comes from his book, The Lorax, and the Lorax is actually the source of one potential extra credit paper that you can do in this class. But I just wanted to extract one brief quote just for food for thought about this topic of private property. And what Dr. Seuss wrote in this book was this. He says, "I'm being quite useful. This thing is a theed. A theed is a fine something that all people need. It's a shirt, it's a sock, it's a glove, it's a hat, but it has other uses, yes, far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, or curtains, or covers for bicycle seats." Now, why am I reading this quote in this class? Well, the idea here is Dr. Seuss is talking about this theed, this character, the Onceler, is explaining to the Lorax what a theed is. The Lorax has never seen a theed before, but it's created, and he's attempting to create something that all people need, right? This is something that people lived without for years, forever, and now people need to have it. Well, that's what capitalists do, is they create products that change our culture in a way that people essentially have to have these things, and can't imagine living without them. So think about whether you have a cell phone, right? 20 years ago, or certainly 30 years ago, people didn't have cell phones. Now it becomes almost a necessity, and we all are essentially not required, but it makes it very difficult to live a life without a cell phone and a lot of other things that we have come to assume is needed and normal. But I talk about this because we should be critical to question whether we really need these things that capitalists teach us that we need, because often we end up filling our houses with possessions that we don't actually need or don't bring us joy. Okay, another concept Marx talks about is objectification. Now, this is related to commodification, but specifically related to the commodification of human beings or the objectification of human beings. That's the idea. The idea here is that we treat human beings not as people, but rather objects. And one really powerful and awful example of this is slavery. Here is a picture of a, a slave auction where white potential slave owners are bidding on human beings to own them. Now, the question is, do we have modern parallels with this? Well, sadly, there is still a problem of human trafficking and slavery in the world now. But there's another analogy I want to just put out there, something to think about, and that is something that happens every year. You have the NBA draft or an NFL draft. You have essentially, in most cases, wealthy white men bidding on the services of potential players that are often racial minorities. Now, we look at these two examples, and the person may come to the conclusion that this is not the same type of exploitation. But Marx argued that it didn't matter how much a worker was paid. If they were engaged in alienated, meaningless labor, then they would still be a slave, right? If the labor is forced upon them. No one is forcing an NBA player to play in the NBA, but I think there's an interesting parallel to think about is to what degree are we continuing to objectify workers in our culture? To what degree does the capitalist class view the proletariat as objects rather than human beings? Okay, now that brings us to Marx's, what I would argue is probably his main concept, and that's alienation. Another way to phrase or word to think about in this is estrangement. The idea here is it's a parallel with the idea of the conflict perspective. There's a struggle between a person and something else. There's a struggle going on, and a person is alienated or estranged from something else. And Marx lists 5 different things that people are alienated from in modern capitalistic societies. First, the product of his or her labor, his or her work itself, the work, his or her fellow human beings, themselves, right? People are alienated relative to themselves, and lastly, the productive process in capitalism is alienated relative to nature, right? Here he's talking about the ecological or environmental impacts of capitalistic production. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So first, people are alienated from the product of their labor. I've taken a picture here of a Arby's sandwich. This is a beef and cheddar sandwich, which many people enjoy eating, but I put a picture up here because you think not of the sandwich from the perspective of the consumer, the person eating it, but rather the person buying it. I'm not talking about the person buying, the person making it. The person who's making these hour after hour, day after day, and working for Arby's will, Marx argues, will learn to dislike or hate or be alienated relative to this product, right? They take no joy or pride in the product when the labor that is done to produce this product is alienated. Again, a worker in a fast food restaurant does not have a sort of a choice about how things are going to be done. They're just following a script, and so they'll learn to hate that product. Now, there's one product that many people like, probably most people like, and that's ice cream, right? Again, if you're working in an ice cream shop, you may be engaging in alienated labor. And as much as you might like ice cream when you started the job, eventually you do this job long enough, you will learn to dislike ice cream. The last thing you want to have when you end the day of working in an ice cream shop is an ice cream cone. Now, This is not always the case, and it's an interesting situation to think of when would someone be alienated and when would they not. Think about two hypothetical people. One person who works for a low wage, say a minimum wage worker who goes in and works 8 hours a day scooping ice cream in an ice cream shop. Um, that person may most likely would be alienated, right? On the other hand, if you are an owner of a ice cream shop, say a small business, and you conceive of the ice cream flavors, right? You think of them in your mind, you develop them over time, and you develop the recipes and whatnot, and you take pride in creating something original and special for your customers to eat. In that case, because your mental and physical work mental and physical labor are combined, it would not necessarily be alienating. Actually, it would be the kind of labor that Marx would think is a true need. So, in that case, you may very much love the product that you're making, but when you're working for a company, say you're working for Baskin Robbins or something like that, and you're not engaged in the productive process, you haven't had any input in what you're scooping into these cones, then it will become an alienated process because you don't have pride in the product yourself. All right. Um, so, in short, if somebody's working day after day with no input in what's going on, they will learn to dislike or be alienated relative to the product of their work. I mean, for example, I take a picture here of a pencil factory. People who are making pencils all day, the last thing they want to see when they get home is a pencil, right? This is not a source of pride for them, but rather it's something that is exhausting them and not making them feel good. Rather, they are made to feel miserable when they're engaged in forced alienated labor. Okay, secondly, Marx argues that workers are alienated relative to the work itself. Now, can you imagine working in a sweatshop, sewing the same articles of clothing all day long? It's drudgery. It's monotonous, and people would learn to hate it. Right? This is a manufacturing type of work, but that service type of work is also alienating. Imagine think to yourself if you've worked in a restaurant. Now, I've worked in a restaurant when I was a younger person, and I know exactly how this feels. I worked in the back in a kitchen, and I would work 6 or 8 hour shifts. I'm a punctual person, so I would show up. I would typically about 5 or 10 minutes early, and I would sit in my car and just for that 5 or 10 minutes, dreading walking in the door and having to work for that 6 or 8 hours. That I felt like I was just giving up myself for that time, right? That work, I hated the job. But I had to do it for a wage, and I think many of the people, maybe most of the people that I was working with, didn't like their job either, but they did it because they needed the money. This is alienated labor. People don't like what they're doing. Think to yourself, have you ever had a job where you'd rather not go and do that work, where you don't have any say in what you're doing? That's alienated labor. Labor doesn't have to be that way. Marx argues that human beings have a need to work, that we we have a natural desire to work, but not meaningless labor, but rather labor through which we can combine our mental and physical capabilities and produce something that we're proud of. Your labor that lifts you up and develops you as a human being, not labor that tears you down. Alienated labor is the type of labor where you're exhausted and torn down by the labor, not developed by the labor. Third, you have Marx argues that human beings are alienated relative to other human beings. And what he means here is that in capitalistic societies, there's a competitive spirit that is so pervasive and negative that people see each other as competition. So in this so-called dog-eat-dog world of capitalism, people will do what they can to compete with others, to step on other people's throats to get ahead. This is what Marx would argue, that we don't work in a cooperative way, but rather in a competitive way. And this is not how Marx would argue this is not natural, not the way things are naturally, but it's just developed in capitalism. Now, there are other cultures, for example, that are more cooperative. I'll give an example. In both Mexico and in Japan, there's an interesting culture within schools. That is, if one student is standing out as being markedly better at a particular subject than his or her classmates, that student is not put up on a pedestal and celebrated as they may be in the United States, but instead there's a social pressure for that student to pull up his or her classmates to his or her level, right? That the goal is not to stand out from the crowd above everyone else, but rather to lift up all of your classmates. It's a cooperative perspective, not a competitive perspective or culture. Marx argues in capitalism we have developed a tremendously competitive culture, and he's very critical of that because it leads to really negative interpersonal relationships. Interestingly, Marx also argues that human beings, when they're engaged in alienated labor, are alienated relative to themselves, right? What he means here is that if you engage in alienated labor long enough, you will start to not like who you have become, right? If you're doing a job that you hate, over time, you're going to look at yourself in the mirror and you're going to wish that you were not what you have become. Instead, you look and you say, well, what was my potential? What was my goal? What did I hope to become? And after 10, 20, 30, 40 years of alienated labor, you look in the mirror and you say, I wish I was something else. I wish I had done something with my life that made me proud and had meaning, and I didn't work just for a wage, right, or a salary. So Marx argues that when people engage in alienated labor, they become alienated relative to themselves. Finally, Marx argues that the productive process in capitalism is also alienating relative to nature. That is, capitalists exploit the natural environment in seek of profits to such a degree that it is tremendously harmful to the environment, and frankly in ways that are increasingly tremendously troubling. I'll talk about through some specific examples. Here are a few pictures of oil spills, and you probably heard of the famous BP oil spill, in which there was an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico that spewed crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico for 87 days. During those 87 days, how much oil was spilled into the Gulf of Mexico? 4.9 million barrels of oil. Or another measure of that is 210 million gallons of oil were spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, what were they doing in that 87 days? Well, after they realized this well had been breached and was spewing oil into the Gulf of Mexico, they had to spend months and months drilling what's called a relief well. Well, a relief well is a second hole drilled through the earth that they had to drill down, and essentially that allowed them to stop the oil gushing out of the oil well. Now, other countries require that a relief well be drilled prior to any oil being extracted, but the United States didn't require that. That would be the dreaded, what capitalists dread, and that is government regulation. And the point here is that if a relief well had been drilled prior to that oil spill, the oil would have gushed out of that well for a much shorter period of time. But it is less profitable if a oil company has to drill um, two holes down to the oil, the main hole, and then a relief well. And so, but other countries require relief wells to be drilled as a safety measure. Um, I really wish, and I'm sure we all wish, that the relief well would have been drilled in this particular case, but profit was more important than the potential catastrophic consequences for our natural environment. Another example of alienation relative to nature is the overfishing of our oceans. We have fished our oceans to such a degree that we are losing a tremendous number of the fish. In fact, 90% of the large predatory fish that once existed in our oceans are now gone. 9 out of 10, 90%. And just to give you some perspective about how we're exhausting the resources of our oceans, in 1900, the oceans had about 6 times as many fish as they had in 2009. So in that time, between 1900 and 2009, we had lost 5 out of 6 of the fish in our oceans. A tremendous, tremendous loss that is probably never going to be regained. There's also tremendous problems with air and water pollution. We are producing things in a way that are tremendously detrimental to our natural environment. Statistics suggest that more than 50,000 Americans die each year due to air pollution-related diseases. Now, this was a problem up until the 1960s. In the 1960s, we passed clean air and clean water regulations, but in the 2000s, with the election of George W. Bush, his administration repealed many of those regulations, and unfortunately, we see a measurable increase in the air and water pollution that exists. And it's not just in the United States. There's tremendous problems in other countries. In India, for example, a country with over 1 billion people, they have serious problems with drinkable water. It's just tremendously problematic. Okay, another issue is strip mining. This is a procedure in which we essentially drill into the ground, not drill, but we dig into the ground and try to get the natural mineral resources. Literally, companies will chop off the tops of buildings or create huge holes in the ground to try to get these materials, and the resulting pollution of the runoff of these strip mines is tremendously problematic. Okay, another really devastating process is deforestation. This is the idea that we're cutting down trees. We're doing this globally. That statistics suggest that every single minute, there's 20 football fields of forests being cut down. And projections have it that at this rate, in 100 years, there will be no rainforests left. Now none of us may be here, probably will not be here in 100 years, but our children and our grandchildren will be here. And what will the world be like? Just to give you some perspective, 20% of the world's oxygen is produced by the Amazon rainforest. If that rainforest is cut down, and projections are that it will be within 100 years, then where is the oxygen we breathe going to come from? It's a tremendous problem, but there seems to be no slowing down of the cutting down of these rainforests. In fact, over the next 25 years, the projections are that 28,000 different plant and animal species will become extinct as a result of deforestation. And with them goes a tremendous amount of biodiversity, and who knows what benefits might be gained by being able to tap into that biodiversity, which will be gone because we're cutting down forests all around the world, all in the name of progress and profit. Okay, that gives us an overview of Marx's set of 5 different ways in which people are alienated in capitalistic society. I wanted to read one quote related to this idea, and he's writing about workers here, the proletariat. He says that he is not what he ought to be and ought to be what he could be. The idea here is that in alienated labor, the worker is not what he ought to be, that each human being has a potential or an essence that through labor they will achieve their or realize their true potential. But this doesn't happen in alienated labor, and it ought to. He ought to be what he could be. Alienated labor keeps this development from taking place. Instead, the worker ceases to be fulfilled by this labor, and instead is denied. That the idea here is that we're not built up by our labor as labor ought to do, or work ought to do, but instead we're exhausted and torn down as a result of work. It promotes feelings of misery. We're talking about alienated labor here. Alienated labor promotes feelings of misery rather than positive feelings that should come from unalienated labor. And the physical and mental powers of human beings are exhausted through alienated labor. Instead, what should happen is our physical and mental capabilities should be enhanced and developed as a result of work. But alienated labor doesn't allow for this. It is external to human nature. It is not the type of work that human beings ought to be doing. It's forced and not voluntary. Essentially, alienated labor is to fulfill someone else's need, not the worker's need, but someone else's need. Well, who else's need is satisfied as a result of labor? It's the needs of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. Those are the people who benefit from the exploitive relationship that exists in capitalism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The workers, the proletariat, are just living a minimal existence just to survive in pure capitalism. And this is also not conducive to the species being viewpoint. Marx again believed that human beings had a species being viewpoint. It was an aspect of human nature for us to look out for what is best for the group rather than just for ourselves as individuals. But alienated labor promotes individualistic thoughts. When people engage in alienated labor, they become increasingly individualistic because they're living a hand-to-mouth existence. They lose sight of what is their true nature, and according to Marx, and that is more altruistic and socially beneficial perspectives. Alienated labor keeps us from thinking about what's best for everyone, and only leads to us to focus on what's in our own individual interest. Now, turning our attention to capitalism in general, we've talked a lot about Marx's critique of capitalism, but here we're looking at it more directly, and one thing he really focuses on is the idea of material gain. In capitalism, material gain is the sole or primary focus of human beings. What we're taught to aspire to have in capitalism is an infinite amount of material possessions or private property, to exclusion of other true needs that Marx argues are much more important, and that is developing meaningful, passionate relationships with other human beings. That is a true need, but material gain is a false and created need, a need that is created by capitalists to get people to consume and to buy their goods and services. Now, this idea of material gain is not a universal motivation. The vast majority of human history was spent in what Marx calls primitive communism, or hunting and gathering societies, where there was not this focus on material possessions and individualistic private property. That is invention of modern capitalistic societies, and even in the so-called socialist or communist societies that have existed, they really haven't gotten away from this material gain as a main focus. And you'll never achieve true communism unless you have a universal or near universal acceptance of this idea that material gain is not what leads to a satisfying life. So here's another quote about the workers in a capitalistic society. Marx says, the worker must have just what is necessary for him to want to live, and must want to live in order to have this. What he's talking about here is, what type of worker does the capitalist ideally produce in a capitalistic society? The bourgeoisie or the capitalists want workers who will work for as little as possible, just enough to keep them wanting to live, and and the idea is that the ideal worker would want to live just to have this meager return on their labor. Another interesting point about Marx and capitalism is that Marx is not really focused on the redistribution of wealth. His critique is more about forced, alienated, and meaningless labor. So if you have someone who's engaged in alienated labor, paying them more for the same job is not going to solve the problems of capitalism. In his words, they would still be slaves. And so what you need to do is eliminate the forced, alienated, meaningless labor that exists in capitalism. That is the only way to escape this system of capitalism. Now, we talked earlier about how one aspect of alienated labor is that one negative outcome is that people become alienated relative to their co-workers or fellow human beings. And this has a broader effect, not just with the people that they work with, but people who are engaged in alienated labor and in capitalism increasingly see other human beings as only in terms of what they can get out of the relationship they have with them for themselves, right? So people become indifferent to one another, only see other people for what they can get out of them, rather than seeing a potential relationship as an end in and of itself. The idea, Marx would argue that the point of getting to know other human beings is to develop meaningful, deep, passionate relationships with those people, and that those relationships would be their own end. But a capitalist would not see it that way. A capitalist would see a relationship with another human being just in terms of what they can get for themselves out of that relationship. There's also an increased what Marx calls political centralization, depoliticalization, and polarization. What he means here is essentially two things: that people become increasingly apathetic and disengaged from the political process. They don't vote, they don't get involved in politics, they feel relatively powerless. And as a result, there's a concentration of power in the hands of very few people. And you can see this becoming exacerbated in our current political climate, in which we have the millionaires and billionaires having undue influence, and corporations having this undue influence and on politics and politicians. And as a result, the individual, the typical American, feels relatively powerless to have much influence on politics. The last topic I want to talk about in this presentation has got to do with the expanding markets of capitalism. There's two related aspects here. First is that this idea, they're both related to the idea of progress, that there's an underlying assumption that capitalism is always progressing to something better and better. An example of this is that our cell phones, for example, become capable of doing more and more and more. And so what the capitalists are really interested in is getting us to spend our money on their product. And so they create this culture in which we feel as if we need to have the most recent cell phone, for example, or the latest car. And so we buy we get rid of things or discard things that are perfectly fine, working perfectly fine, and buy something new because that's what we're taught that we should have. An example of this would be from the music industry, that, in my lifetime I've seen music being sold as vinyl records, 8-track tapes, cassette tapes, CDs, and now you know computer files that are a form of music, right? The idea here is that capitalist succeeds in getting the consumer to buy the same product over and over and over, with the idea that it's better and better and better. Now, even more problematic than this is the exporting of a capitalistic culture worldwide. That the capitalists will go to every corner of the earth to find so-called untapped markets and get people who have engaged in cultures that have been self-sustaining for literally centuries, and try to get these people to change their culture into a consumerist-oriented, consumption-based culture like that of developed countries. So, for example, the United States. So these third world countries are taught to consume like Americans do, and this has tremendously problematic potential consequences for humanity. Frankly, just a really powerful statistic to think about is what has happened in my lifetime. I was born in 1967, and in my lifetime, the number of human beings has doubled. Right? In 1967, there were 3.5 billion people on this planet. Now there's over 7 billion people on this planet. This level of population explosion is unsustainable, and instead of trying to cut back on how consumer and consumption-oriented our culture is, instead we're promoting this type of consumption-oriented culture throughout the world. And it is simply unsustainable. We cannot continue to have populations exploding and having human beings consume in a way that is at the levels of North Americans today. But the bourgeoisie continue to do this because it leads to their enhanced profit. Right? They're making more and more money, but the cost is potentially devastating for our species. And so it's a perfect example of how the capitalist has their own individual interest in their minds as the priority, rather than what is best for all of humanity. And so they line their pockets and make tremendous amounts of profit, but they're doing so in a system that is unsustainable long term. Okay, that concludes the second of 3 presentations on Marx, and I encourage you to post your comments and questions on this presentation on our Desire to Learn website, and thank you very much for listening.